This is also a time of change for my family.
The confrontation began with something so small that almost nobody outside Highgrove would have noticed it. A locked archive room, a restricted request, and one name written on the access sheet. Prince Harry had demanded entry to a collection King Charles III had personally ordered sealed. Within minutes, Charles learned what had happened. His reaction was instant. The king stopped the meeting in front of him, dismissed the room, and demanded to know exactly how far Harry had gone. Charles read the request once, then again, slower this time. Highgrove House was more than a royal residence. It was one of his personal homes, and its private archive was a secured collection of letters, notes, family records, and estate material gathered across decades. That mattered, because some of those papers touched the most painful years of his life. The monarch lowered the page, kept both hands against the table, and quietly said Harry's name. Harry saw the same collection very differently. He believed those records contained pieces of his own childhood, references to Princess Diana, and private conversations that may have shaped decisions made about him when he was too young to understand them. To him, the refusal did not feel like routine protection. It felt like another part of his past had been placed behind a door and labeled off-limits. And this time, he was no longer willing to accept silence. Charles's anger sharpened when the private secretary explained what had actually happened. A restricted file was not simply hidden material, it was a record placed under tighter access rules, so that even family members needed direct permission to see it. Harry had not merely asked whether the collection existed. He had tried to discover whether another route into the archive could be used after the first barrier went up. That detail changed everything. The king could understand curiosity. He could even understand resentment. What he could not accept was the idea that a boundary carrying his authority had been tested from the side. The private secretary watched Charles's expression harden as he asked one question after another. Who received the request? What exact reference Harry used, and whether anyone had already shown him an index. Then came the detail that unsettled Charles more than the request itself. Harry had not asked for a broad search. He had identified a narrow group of records with surprising precision. That meant someone had told him enough to know where to look. Charles could shut a door, but he could not erase the reason Harry had gone looking for it. And that reason would soon drag father and son back into wounds neither had ever truly settled. Behind the locked archive was a conflict far older than the records themselves. Charles saw the Highgrove collection as private territory built across a lifetime. Harry saw parts of it as fragments of his own history. That difference turned a security dispute into something painfully personal. One man believed a boundary had been crossed. The other believed the boundary had been drawn specifically to keep him out, and neither interpretation left much room for forgiveness. Harry carried that hurt into a private conversation with an advisor after the refusal. Highgrove had never been just another royal house to him. It held memories of childhood, family routines, arguments, departures, and the long shadow of Diana, Princess of Wales. For Charles, the same place represented years of correspondence, estate planning, fatherhood, and private decisions made long before he became king. That history mattered, because both men believed they had a legitimate emotional claim to it. Yet only one controlled the keys. Harry pushed his chair back and said he was tired of discovering that parts of his own life seemed to belong to everyone except him. He insisted he was not asking for ceremonial privilege. A royal privilege, in plain terms, is a special access or status attached to someone's position in the family. He wanted answers, especially about decisions made when he and Prince William were still children. The advisor listened as his frustration hardened into something quieter: suspicion. Charles reacted in the opposite way. After the briefing, he stood alone and treated Harry's persistence as another refusal to accept a boundary. The king said family history did not automatically become family property, then fell silent. He knew the restricted index carried references to correspondence from the final years of his marriage to Diana, private exchanges with palace advisors, and notes involving the young princes. Those records were painful, not because they promised one explosive secret, but because they captured people making choices under pressure. Harry, however, was not searching the archive at random. He kept returning to one narrow period, one cluster of dates, and one reference that appeared to connect several private conversations. That focus disturbed Charles more than any broad demand ever could. It suggested his son was looking for a particular letter, decision, or account, not simply trying to understand the past. Then an aide remembered something that changed the entire timeline. Months earlier, after a tense family gathering, Harry had mentioned the same date almost casually. The archive battle had not begun at Highgrove at all. Its real beginning lay in a private family encounter, when one careless sentence gave Harry a reason to start searching. Months before anyone spoke about restricted archives, Prince Harry heard 6 words that would not leave him alone. They came during a private family gathering, almost casually, from someone who apparently did not realize what they were revealing. Harry said little at the time. He simply absorbed the implication and changed the subject. But from that evening onward, he became convinced that Highgrove contained something about his childhood that he had never been allowed to see. Harry already knew how guarded royal conversations had become around him. Requests for old family correspondence were handled carefully. Answers came in narrow pieces, and unrestricted access to personal collections remained out of reach. Clarence House, the London residence long associated with Charles, became the setting for the moment that changed everything. After a private memorial dinner, an elderly former royal aide spoke about the past and said, almost under his breath, "Your father kept the original account." Harry immediately asked what that meant. The aide stopped. Harry found him again later and pressed harder. He asked what original account referred to and whether it involved him, Prince William, or the final years of Charles's marriage to Diana, Princess of Wales. The former aide refused to answer directly. He only said that some things had been placed at Highgrove for a reason. That sentence did more damage than an explanation might have done, because it gave Harry something worse than confirmation. It gave him a direction. Harry's curiosity hardened into suspicion after that exchange. He began to believe the hidden material could contain private decisions made about him and William during the collapse of their parents' marriage, decisions they had been too young to understand. The prince did not know whether the records held criticism, protection, or something far more painful. But he knew silence had surrounded that period for years, and now one careless comment suggested that a fuller account had survived. Then Harry found the detail that made the search dangerous. Through a documented archive reference shared during a later private exchange with the same former aide, he identified a restricted Highgrove correspondence code tied to the exact period that had been mentioned after the memorial dinner. The date matched, the category matched, and suddenly, what had begun as a vague suspicion had become a target. Charles understood the danger the moment that code appeared in the access request. His anger changed because Harry was no longer searching blindly. He had come dangerously close to a collection the king had protected for decades. And once Charles understood how much Harry knew, the dispute stopped being about access and became a direct confrontation between a father defending his boundary and a son demanding the truth. There were no advisors sitting between them when Charles finally faced Harry. No cameras, no public statements, just a father, a son, and a locked collection neither was willing to surrender. Charles entered carrying the archive request himself. He placed it on the table without sitting down. Harry immediately knew what the conversation was about. Then, Charles delivered the accusation directly. Harry had not simply asked a question. He had tried to cross a line the king had personally drawn. Charles kept the meeting away from the archive because he wanted one thing clear. This was still a family confrontation, not yet a formal palace dispute. A formal palace dispute, in plain terms, would mean the disagreement had moved beyond private family tension into an official matter handled through royal staff and procedure. The original request had already been denied. What Charles wanted now was an answer. Why had Harry kept searching for another route after being told no? Harry did not retreat. Charles placed the archive reference sheet on the table and said, "You had no right to do this." The prince stayed on his feet and answered that no one had ever explained why records touching his own childhood had been hidden from him. Harry's voice sharpened as he argued that silence had created the suspicion Charles now resented. The king pushed his chair back and replied that privacy was not proof of wrongdoing. That sentence should have ended the argument. Instead, it opened the most dangerous part of it. Harry told Charles that he already knew one restricted file contained correspondence written during one of the family's most painful periods. He did not claim to know every detail, but he knew enough to identify the era and the archive reference. Charles froze for a beat, then asked the question that mattered more than anything else. Who had told him? Harry refused. He said the source was not the issue, the records were. Charles heard something very different. To the king, that refusal meant someone inside or close to the trusted circle around Highgrove had disclosed information that should never have traveled beyond it. A private archive was a controlled collection of personal papers, and its security depended on trust as much as locks. If that trust had failed once, Charles had no way of knowing how far the breach had spread. Charles ended the meeting without another argument. He ordered an immediate review of every recent access request, every catalog search, and every person permitted near the restricted collection. Harry came seeking the past, but Charles was about to use the full authority of the present, and the next move would show exactly where royal power still rested. Charles did not answer Harry with another argument. He answered with an order. Before the day was over, access procedures surrounding the Highgrove archive were rewritten. Names were removed. Permissions were narrowed. One collection received an additional level of restriction. Yet behind those administrative moves stood a deeply personal decision. Charles had concluded that protecting the archive now meant protecting it even from his own son. Charles moved quickly because delay now looked dangerous. As king and custodian of his private papers, he held the practical authority to decide who could examine restricted Highgrove material. A custodian, in simple terms, is the person responsible for protecting and controlling access to a collection. He instructed a small circle of archivists and private staff to suspend informal family access while every recent request and catalog search was checked. Prince William received the briefing in private and listened without interrupting. He rubbed one hand across his forehead, then asked whether Harry had truly tried to bypass the original refusal. William was not furious. He was disappointed. The future king understood why his brother wanted answers about the past, but he also understood what forced access could destroy. If Harry pushed past Charles's boundary, the last scraps of trust between father and son might collapse completely. Charles heard William's concern and did not dismiss it. He knew the prince was trapped between sympathy for Harry and loyalty to the rules now being tightened. Then the review produced something worse. Someone had previously searched the archive catalog using terminology linked to the same restricted file Harry later requested. An archive catalog is simply the internal list used to identify where records are stored and how they are classified. That meant Harry's precision was almost certainly not accidental. Charles responded by separating the sensitive Highgrove records from the broader private collection while the source of the leak was examined. He did not want another surprise. William understood the severity of that move immediately because it meant the issue had crossed from family tension into controlled containment. Harry had wanted one answer, but the search itself had now triggered a security response around the king's personal history. Then Charles approved the decision that would hurt most. For William, the punishment felt painfully familiar. Another family disagreement had become a rule. Another wounded conversation had been replaced by procedure and distance between them both. Harry was informed that his ability to make future requests for private royal archive material was being temporarily withdrawn. The locked cabinet was only the beginning, because when Harry received Charles's decision, the emotional cost of challenging the king suddenly became impossible to ignore. Harry had expected another refusal. He had not expected the door to close completely. When the message arrived, he read the final paragraph twice. His future access to sensitive private collections associated with the king had been suspended. The punishment was administrative in wording, but deeply personal in meaning. Harry had gone searching for proof that he had been excluded from his family's past, and his search had now excluded him even further from its present. Harry finished the notice, folded it once, and left it untouched on the table. The decision was narrow in legal effect. It did not change his public identity, family connection, or place in the royal family. It applied only to requests involving restricted private archival material, meaning records kept under controlled access because of their personal or sensitive nature. That detail mattered, but emotionally it offered little comfort. To him, the message still felt like another locked gate between father and son. Charles justified the restriction through a documented internal decision shared with senior staff. He argued that trust around Highgrove access procedures had been compromised, and that temporary limits were necessary until the review was complete. Harry heard the reasoning and felt the hurt underneath it. He told the person beside him that the king had taken a family disagreement and turned it into procedure. The words were bitter, but the anger did not fully hide the sadness. Harry still possessed one thing Charles could not take back: the archive reference number. He knew the concealed material existed, he knew the period it covered, and he knew enough to understand that the file had been protected for years. That knowledge kept the question alive even after access vanished. The restriction could stop him from reaching the records, but it could not make him forget why he had started searching. Then the internal review found the loose thread everyone had feared. Charles was informed through a written security summary that the former aide who had spoken carelessly after the memorial dinner had been identified as the source who first pointed Harry toward the Highgrove material. The king could have responded with another sanction. He could have tightened the circle further, punished the breach, and let silence harden into permanent distance between them. Instead, Charles made a choice nobody expected. He requested one final private conversation with Harry, with no aides, no secretaries, no archive officials present, and no agenda to hide behind. For the first time since the confrontation began, the monarch was preparing to speak not as sovereign to subject, but as father to son, and that would change the entire meaning of the dispute. The second meeting felt nothing like the first. Charles did not bring the access request. Harry did not arrive with questions written down. There were no officials outside the conversation waiting to interpret the result. Charles simply told his son to sit. Then, within this dramatized account, he explained why the Highgrove collection had remained sealed. What Harry had taken as deliberate concealment, his father said, belonged to one of the most painful chapters their family had ever endured. Charles described the restricted files as deeply personal correspondence, involving himself, Diana, trusted advisors, and discussions about protecting William and Harry during periods of intense family strain. Private correspondence, in simple terms, means letters, notes, or recorded exchanges never intended for public release. The king said those records had been preserved because they captured people speaking in fear, grief, anger, and confusion. To him, they were not evidence waiting to settle an argument years later. They were wounds kept on paper. Harry asked the question that had been driving him from the beginning. Did those papers contain judgments about him? Charles hesitated before answering. He admitted that some passages concerned both sons, but insisted he would not turn conversations from their childhood into weapons between them as adults. The prince listened, and the anger that had carried him into the first confrontation began to weaken. What replaced it was not relief, it was disappointment. Harry told Charles that secrecy itself had shaped much of his resentment. Every silence had left space for another suspicion. Every closed door had encouraged him to imagine something worse than the truth. The king did not interrupt. He understood that protecting private memories had also created distance, and that distance had eventually become mistrust. Charles then offered the first real compromise of the entire dispute. Harry would not receive unrestricted possession of the archive, but selected records directly concerning him could eventually be reviewed under controlled conditions. Controlled access meant supervised viewing without taking ownership of the wider collection. The prince would get answers, but not the power to open everything. Then Charles delivered the revelation Harry had not expected. Some of the material he had feared did not contain one devastating betrayal. Instead, the records described adults struggling, imperfectly, to shield both boys from a family collapse they could not stop. That truth softened the battle, but it did not end the danger. News of the Highgrove confrontation had already escaped the private circle. Father and son had finally lowered their voices, but outside those walls the story was about to become louder than either of them wanted. By morning, the dispute was no longer private. The words Highgrove, Harry, and restricted records dominated royal discussion, transforming a personal confrontation into a national argument about privacy, history, family entitlement, and the limits of royal access. Supporters divided instantly. Some saw a son desperate to understand his past. Others saw a direct challenge to the king's boundaries. Then one striking public image captured the entire mood better than any palace statement could. William watched the coverage from Windsor and understood immediately what was being lost. The private compromise between Charles and Harry was being flattened into something easier to sell. Father against son, king against prince, locked records against a demand for truth. A private family archive, in simple terms, is a collection of personal papers not automatically open to relatives or the public. That distinction mattered because the argument was not simply about secrecy. It was about who had the right to control memories that belonged emotionally to several people at once. Charles reacted with irritation when advisors summarized the morning coverage. He refused suggestions that he issue an angry rebuttal or release details from the private conversation with Harry. The king knew that defending himself too aggressively would expose the very family pain he had tried to protect. Instead, palace messaging stayed narrow, stressing archive procedure, privacy, and controlled access, while avoiding the emotional details that had driven the confrontation. William feared that restraint would be misunderstood. He knew Harry had not received everything he wanted, but he also knew Charles had moved further toward compromise than the public realized. Commentators, however, were already asking a larger question. Was this really a fight over papers, or a struggle over who controlled the meaning of royal family history? That question pushed the story beyond one archive and into something much more dangerous. Outside Highgrove, the public mood hardened into a single unforgettable symbol. In this dramatized account, a small crowd gathered near the gates as television crews lined the roadside, and one fictional newspaper front page carried the words, "Father, Son, and the Locked Royal Past." Harry's name filled the discussion. Charles's silence filled it even more. The closed gates became a symbol of the argument itself. Protection to some, exclusion to others. For Harry, the coverage reopened every frustration. For Charles, it proved that even a carefully guarded family wound could become public property overnight. Then the king made his choice. he would not surrender the archive, and he would not shut Harry out completely. Public opinion could argue forever, but only Charles could decide how this confrontation ended, and his final answer would reveal whether anger or fatherhood had ultimately won. Charles's final decision satisfied neither extreme. Harry would not seize the Highgrove records. The king would not surrender unrestricted control of the private collection. But neither would Charles permanently deny his son every piece of his own history. The furious confrontation ended with a carefully drawn boundary. Selected material directly concerning Harry could be reviewed under supervision, while the wider forbidden archive would remain sealed. It was not victory for Harry or defeat for Charles. It was something harder: acceptance. Charles confirmed through a documented private directive that the Highgrove collection would remain under strict restriction. A private directive, in simple terms, is an internal instruction that sets rules without turning the matter into a public declaration. The reason was clear. The archive contained correspondence involving several people whose words had never been meant for public use, and opening everything would risk turning private grief into permanent evidence. Harry was given limited permission to review records directly tied to his childhood, but he could not remove, freely copy, or control the wider collection. Harry asked one final question during their private exchange. Did Charles actually believe him when he said he only wanted answers? The king answered without anger. Wanting answers had never been the problem, he said. Refusing the boundary was. Harry did not argue. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the line his father had drawn was not necessarily a denial of his pain, even if it had felt like one for years. Charles then acknowledged something just as important. Silence had helped create the suspicion. He admitted that keeping difficult memories sealed had left too much room for Harry to imagine something worse than the truth. The prince accepted something in return. Discovering a painful past did not automatically give him ownership over every private memory connected to it. The feared file delivered no single explosive betrayal. Instead, within this dramatized account, the selected records showed fragmented attempts by adults to protect two boys, while the family around them was breaking under enormous pressure. That truth was quieter than Harry expected, but far more painful. Charles's fury finally gave way to restraint. Harry did not get the archive he tried to reach, but he did get part of the truth he had spent so long searching for. The real danger had never been the records themselves. It was what years of silence had allowed father and son to believe about each other. And with that boundary finally understood, the Highgrove doors remained closed. But the silence between Charles and Harry no longer did. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.